If you think your Monday morning commute is rough or your boss is a nightmare, take a second to imagine your workplace being 1,000 feet underground in a cramped Roman tunnel with nothing but a flicking oil lamp and the distinct sound of the ceiling groaning under the weight of a mountain. History is often painted as a series of grand speeches and royal weddings, but the actual engine of civilization was fueled by the sweat and peril of people working jobs that would make a modern safety inspector faint on the spot. We are talking about roles where a bad day at the office meant you simply didn't come home, and where the hazards weren't just part of the job, they were the job. Today, we are stepping into the boots, sandals, and soot-covered rags of the people who did the dirty work. We are counting down the most perilous occupations from every century, tracing how human ambition has always required a price that few were willing to pay, but many were forced to endure. Let's start our journey in the ancient world, specifically the 1st century. If you wanted to be at the top of the hazard pay list, you were looking at the life of a Roman galley ower. Forget the Hollywood version where everyone is a ripped bodybuilder having a great time on the open sea. The reality was a claustrophobic, rhythmic nightmare. These men were often chained to their benches in the bowels of massive warships. They lived in a world of darkness, salt spray, and the overwhelming stench of hundreds of unwashed bodies. Their entire existence was dictated by the beat of a drum. When that drum sped up for a ramming maneuver, they had to pull until their muscles tore or their hearts gave out. If the ship was rammed or caught fire, the chains meant they went down with the vessel. There was no evacuation plan. It was a job where you were essentially a human engine component, easily replaced and almost entirely forgotten by the admirals on the sun-drenched decks above. Moving into the 2nd century, the thirst for luxury in the Roman Empire created one of the most hazardous mining jobs in history, the cinnabar miner. Cinnabar is a bright red ore used to make vermilion pigment, highly prized for wall paintings and cosmetics. The problem? Cinnabar is the primary ore of mercury. Roman authorities knew this job was a sentence. They primarily used forced labor because no sane person would volunteer. These workers spent their days in unventilated shafts, breathing in toxic dust and mercury vapors. Over time, the mercury would attack their nervous systems, leading to tremors, loss of minerals in the bones, and eventually a complete mental collapse. It was a job that literally dissolved the person from the inside out. Also, a wealthy senator's wife could have the perfect shade of red on her cheeks, or a fresco could look slightly more vibrant. As we transition into the medieval period, let's look at the 11th century and the role of the castle builder. We admire cathedrals and fortresses today as feats of art, but for the laborer on the ground, it was a vertical house of horrors. Imagine trying to hoist a multi-ton block of limestone 200 feet into the air using nothing but wooden cranes, hemp ropes, and human-powered tread wheels. One frayed rope or a sudden gust of wind meant a catastrophe not just for the person at the top, but for everyone standing in the shadow of the wall. There were no hard hats, no safety harnesses, and the scaffolding was often just planks of wood wedged into holes in the masonry. If you survived the falls, you still had to deal with the lung-clogging stone dust that turned your insides to chalk by the time you were 30. Every grand spire you see in Europe is a monument built on the broken bones of anonymous workers who defied gravity with nothing but grit. By the 13th century, the growth of medieval cities created a desperate need for a job that sounds disgusting because it absolutely was: the night soil collector. Before modern plumbing, everything people produced in their homes went into a wooden bucket or a cesspit in the basement. Someone had to empty those pits under the cover of darkness. This wasn't just a smelly job, it was a biological hazard zone. These workers spent their nights waist-deep in waste, breathing in pockets of methane gas that could knock a person unconscious in seconds. Beyond the fumes, they were the frontline targets for every waterborne illness imaginable, from cholera to typhoid. They were social outcasts, essentially invisible people who performed the most vital hygiene function of the city, while risking their health every single night for a few copper coins. The 15th century brings us to the age of discovery, but for the common sailor, it was the age of scurvy. Being a long-distance navigator or sailor during this time meant signing up for months of isolation on a floating wooden box. The danger wasn't just the storms or the mythical sea monsters. It was the lack of vitamin C. Within weeks of leaving port, men's gums would soften, old scars would mysteriously reopen, and their limbs would swell with fluid. Historians estimate that during this century and the ones that followed, more sailors were lost to nutritional deficiencies than to all shipwrecks and naval battles combined. You were essentially trapped on a vessel where the food was rotting and the very air seemed to sap your vitality. It was a slow, agonizing process where the body simply forgot how to hold itself together, turning a vibrant crew into a collection of shadows before they ever sighted land. Now, let's talk about the 17th century and the Great Plague of London. This era gave us one of the most iconic and terrifying jobs in history, the plague doctor. While the mask with the bird-like beak looks cool in a steampunk kind of way today, it was actually a desperate attempt at personal protective equipment. The beak was stuffed with aromatic herbs like lavender and camphor, intended to filter out the miasma, or bad air thought to carry the illness. These doctors were essentially walking into the epicenter of a localized biological apocalypse. They navigated streets piled high with those who had fallen, often tasked with performing autopsies to understand the spread. Despite their leather cloaks and wooden canes, their protection was minimal. They were moving targets for an invisible enemy they didn't understand. Many of these doctors were young, inexperienced men or those with nothing left to lose, taking on a role that made them symbols of terminal bad news. The 18th century saw the rise of the industrial era's predecessors, but it also saw the height of the whaling industry. Being a whaler in the 1700s was a job for the most desperate or the most adventurous. You would spend years away from home, searching the vast oceans for a creature the size of a building. When a whale was spotted, you jumped into a small wooden rowboat and tried to hit it with a hand-thrown harpoon. Imagine the sheer terror of being towed at 20 miles per hour across the waves by a panicked, multi-ton animal. One flick of a tail could smash the boat into splinters, leaving you miles from the main ship in freezing water. Even if you caught the whale, the work of flensing or stripping the blubber involved boiling giant vats of oil on a rocking wooden deck, a recipe for horrific burns and fires. It was a high-stakes gamble where the ocean, the prey, and the equipment were all trying to end your career permanently. In the 19th century, the world went crazy for matches, which led to one of the most tragic industrial jobs, the matchstick maker, or more specifically, the fosse jar workers. Most of these workers were young women and children who spent 14 hours a day dipping wooden sticks into white phosphorus. The fumes were highly toxic. Over time, the phosphorus would settle into the jawbone, causing it to glow in the dark and then literally rot away. The pain was described as unbearable, and the only cure was the surgical removal of the entire jawbone. This was a job that didn't just pose a risk of injury. It guaranteed a physical transformation that was straight out of a horror movie. It eventually led to some of the first major labor strikes and bans on hazardous chemicals, but not before thousands of workers were physically devastated for the sake of a convenient way to light a fire. As we move into the 20th century, the scale of danger moved from the factory to the sky and the deep. One of the most perilous roles during the mid-century was the ball turret gunner on a B-17 bomber. Imagine being squeezed into a small plexiglass and metal bubble hanging from the belly of a plane at 30,000 feet. It was so cramped you couldn't even wear a parachute while inside. You were the primary target for enemy fighters and ground-based artillery. If the landing gear jammed, you were in the most vulnerable spot on the entire aircraft. The psychological toll of being suspended in a glass ball while the world exploded around you is something most people can't even fathom. It was a job that required a specific kind of bravery and a very small physical frame, placing the individual at the absolute edge of technological hazard. But the 20th century also gave us the radium girls. In the 1920s, young women were hired to paint clock dials with luminous paint so they would glow in the dark. The paint contained radium. To get a fine point on their brushes, the workers were told to lip point them, essentially licking the radium-laden bristles thousands of times a day. They were told the paint was harmless. Some even painted their teeth and nails with it for fun to surprise their boyfriends at night. Slowly, the radium began to replace the calcium in their bones. Their teeth fell out, their hips shattered, and they developed massive tumors. These women had to fight a legal battle from their beds to hold the companies accountable, a landmark case that established the right of individual workers to sue for damages caused by corporate negligence. They were literal glowing martyrs for modern labor laws. If we look at the 21st century, you might think the age of deadly jobs is over. With robots and safety regulations, we should be safe, right? Tell that to the saturation divers. These are the people who maintain oil rigs and underwater pipelines hundreds of feet below the surface. To avoid the bends or decompression sickness, They have to live for weeks at a time in a pressurized chamber the size of a van. Their bodies become saturated with helium and oxygen. If the pressure in their chamber or their suit drops by even a small percentage too quickly, the gases in their blood turn into bubbles, leading to an instantaneous and catastrophic biological failure. It is a job that is as physically and mentally demanding as being an astronaut, but conducted in a high-pressure, pitch-black environment, where one mechanical glitch means everything is over in a heartbeat. We also have to consider the modern e-waste recycler. In parts of the world where environmental laws are loosely enforced, thousands of people, including children, spend their days breaking down our old phones and computers. They use open fires and acid baths to extract gold and copper from the circuit boards. This releases a cocktail of lead, mercury, and flame retardants into the air and soil. It is a slow-motion catastrophe, where the danger isn't a sudden fall or a ship sinking, but the gradual accumulation of heavy metals in the bloodstream. It is the modern equivalent of the cinnabar miner, proving that while our technology changes, the pattern of shifting the most hazardous work to the most vulnerable populations is a cycle that history has yet to break. What ties all these jobs together across 2,000 years? It's the concept of unseen risk. In every century, there was a job that people didn't realize was dangerous until it was too late. The Roman miners didn't know about mercury vapor. The radium girls were told their paint was healthy. The matchstick makers didn't understand the chemistry of phosphorus. History shows us that human progress is often a trial and error process, where the errors are paid for by the workers on the front lines. It takes time for society to recognize a hazard, and even longer to create the laws to stop it. Another common thread is the dehumanization of the worker. Whether it was the chained galley rower or the chimney sweep of the Victorian era, these were roles filled by people who weren't seen as individuals with rights, but as tools to be used until they were broken. The chimney sweep is a particularly heartbreaking example from the 18th and 19th centuries. Small children, some as young as 4, were forced to climb through narrow, soot-filled flues. They suffered from sweeps cancer due to constant contact with carcinogens, and were often physically stunted or deformed by the cramped conditions. It wasn't until the mid-1800s that society finally decided that the convenience of a clean chimney wasn't worth the physical destruction of a child. It's a reminder that safety isn't just a technical achievement, it's a moral one. The evolution of these jobs also reflects our changing energy needs. In the ancient world, the deadliest job was often about human muscle, rowing ships or hauling stone. In the Middle Ages, it moved towards sanitation and construction as cities grew. In the industrial era, the hazards became chemical as we experimented with new materials and fuels. Today, our most dangerous roles are often high-tech, involving extreme pressures, radioactive materials, or the complex waste products of our digital lives. We have moved from the danger of the blunt object to the danger of the invisible molecule. But there is also something to be said for the pride and the resilience of those who did these jobs. Many of the people in these perilous roles formed tight-knit communities. The coal miners of the 19th and 20th centuries, for example, faced the constant threat of black lung and cave-ins, yet they developed a culture of solidarity and music that still influences us today. There is a certain dignity in facing a hazardous world, to provide for a family or to build something that lasts. While we look back at these jobs with horror, the people who did them were the ones who literally built the world we live in. They paved the roads, forged the steel, and cleared the path for the luxuries we take for granted. If you lived in the 14th century, the most dangerous job might have been the plague barrier, tasked with hauling the fallen to mass pits. If you lived in the 19th century, it might have been a stoker on a steamship, shoveling coal into a furnace in a room that reached 140 degrees. Every era has its version of the dirty work that keeps society functioning but puts the individual in the crosshairs of catastrophe. The transition between these eras is marked by the invention of safety. The safety lamp for miners invented in the early 1800s saved countless lives by preventing explosions. The invention of the elevator's safety brake allowed for the construction of skyscrapers without the high loss seen in ancient castle building. Each of these innovations was a victory over the hazards of the workplace. We shouldn't just study history for its wars and kings. We should study it as a long, slow victory of safety over necessity. However, we can't be complacent. The danger just migrates. As one job becomes safe through automation, a new one emerges in a different sector. The gig economy of the 21st century has created its own hazards, from delivery drivers navigating chaotic traffic under the pressure of an algorithm to the content moderators who spend 8 hours a day viewing the darkest corners of the internet to keep it safe for the rest of us. These modern hazards might not break bones or rot jawbones, but they take a toll on mental health and social stability. The landscape of peril is always shifting. Think about the sheer variety of environments these workers occupied: the crushing depths of the ocean, the dizzying heights of cathedral spires, the toxic darkness of mercury mines, and the claustrophobic bubbles of high-altitude bombers. Human beings have been pushed into every conceivable corner of the planet to extract value or defend territory. The most dangerous jobs are a map of human ambition, showing us exactly how far we are willing to push ourselves and others to achieve a goal. It's also fascinating to look at the deadly jobs that were once considered prestigious. In the early days of flight, being an airmail pilot was essentially a one-way ticket. You flew open cockpit planes over mountains with no radio and no reliable instruments. If you hit a fog bank, you were essentially flying blind. Yet these pilots were the celebrities of their day. They weren't forced into the role like the Roman miners. They sought it out for the glory and the thrill, despite the fact that the survival rate was abysmal. It shows that in every century, there is a small group of people who are drawn to the edge, who find the danger to be part of the appeal. One of the most dangerous jobs that still exists in a modified form is that of the Arctic fisherman. Since the 16th century, when Europeans first started fishing the Grand Banks, the combination of freezing water, heavy machinery, and massive waves has been a recipe for disaster. Even today, with satellite weather tracking and modern lifeboats, it remains one of the few occupations where the sea can simply take a vessel and its crew without warning. It is a stark reminder that despite all our technology, nature still has the final say. As we look at this timeline, from the galley rowers of ancient Rome to the saturation divers of today, we see a story of endurance. We see a species that is willing to take incredible risks to improve its lot in life. But we also see a slow, painful awakening of the human conscience. We see a world that has moved from accepting these hazards as just part of life to recognizing them as things that can and should be prevented. Every safety regulation we have today is a tribute to the people who did the work when those regulations didn't exist. The story of the deadliest jobs is a history of the world from the bottom up. It's a story told in the soot on a face, the vibration in a hand, and the heavy breath of someone working against the clock and the odds. Many of these jobs have faded into history, replaced by machines that don't feel pain or breathe toxins. We no longer need children to climb chimneys or men to be chained to oars. That is a form of progress that is just as important as the invention of the internet or the landing on the moon. In the end, the most dangerous times to be a worker were the times when the worker was seen as less than human. As long as we value the individual, we can continue to reduce the hazards of the world. But as we've seen in the 21st century, we must remain vigilant. The danger is a shapeshifter. It hides in new chemicals, in new technologies, and in the global shadows where the rules are thin. Understanding the perils of the past is the only way to ensure that we don't repeat the same mistakes in the future. History is a heavy legacy, but it's also a guide. The next time you find yourself complaining about a long meeting or a malfunctioning printer, take a deep breath and be glad you aren't dipping matches in white phosphorus or rowed out to ram an enemy galley. We live in a world that is safer than it has ever been, built on the sacrifices of those who worked the deadliest jobs in history. They are the silent architects of our comfort, and their stories deserve to be told with respect and wonder. The journey through these centuries shows that while we have increased our power and our knowledge, our most significant achievement might be our empathy. The move to protect the worker is a relatively new development in the grand scheme of things, but it is perhaps our most noble pursuit. We have turned a world of chains and toxins into a world of hard hats and safety manuals. It might be less dramatic for a history textbook, but it is a much better world to live in. Thank you for exploring these perilous roles with me. It's a reminder that the true heroes of history are often the ones whose names we never learned, but whose work made everything else possible. Stay curious, stay safe, and remember that even the messiest parts of our past have a story to tell.